Before we begin this beautiful story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss heartwarming stories like this one. Your support means everything to us. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Sergeant James Mitchell stood at attention in his iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, maintaining the stoic composure expected of a Queen's Guard. At 32 years old, James had served for over a decade, mastering the art of remaining perfectly still despite tourists, weather, and countless distractions. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what was about to happen on this ordinary Tuesday morning. It started with a sound so faint that most people would have missed it entirely. A tiny, desperate mewing that seemed to echo from somewhere near the palace gates. James kept his eyes fixed forward as protocol demanded, but his ears tracked the sound. It came again, more urgent this time, cutting through the chatter of morning tourists and the clicking of cameras. The cry was unmistakably that of a very young animal in distress. For 20 minutes, James remained motionless as the crying continued. His fellow guards stood equally still at their posts, but James could sense their awareness too. The sound was impossible to ignore, tugging at something deep within each person who heard it. Tourists began to look around, trying to locate the source. A little girl pointed toward the ornate iron gates, but her mother pulled her along. Late for their tour schedule, when his shift rotation finally allowed for movement, James broke formation with military precision. He had exactly 3 minutes before he needed to return to his post. Without hesitation, he walked toward the gates where the sound had been coming from. There, wedged between 2 stone pillars and a decorative iron rail, was the tiniest orange kitten James had ever seen. Its fur was matted and dirty, its body so small it could fit in the palm of his hand. The kitten looked up at him with enormous green eyes, filled with fear and desperation. James glanced at his watch. 2 minutes remaining. He couldn't just leave the helpless creature there. Carefully, he reached down and extracted the kitten from its hiding spot. It weighed almost nothing, and he could feel its tiny heart racing against his gloved hand. The kitten let out another weak cry, then seemed to relax slightly in the warmth of his grasp. "What do we have here, Sergeant?" His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, had noticed the breach in protocol and approached with a stern expression. James straightened immediately, holding the kitten carefully against his chest. He expected a reprimand, but Captain Reynolds' expression softened when he saw the tiny creature. The older man had served for 30 years and had seen many unusual situations. But this was certainly a first, James explained quickly. How he had heard the crying during his watch and found the abandoned kitten. Captain Reynolds studied the situation for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. The kitten chose that moment to let out another pitiful meow. Something shifted in the captain's eyes. He nodded once, a slight smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Get that animal to safety, Sergeant," Captain Reynolds said quietly. "We'll cover your post. But do it quickly and discreetly." James saluted with his free hand, grateful beyond words. He tucked the kitten inside his tunic, where it immediately nestled against the warmth of his body. The tiny creature's crying stopped for the first time in what must have been hours. James made his way to the guard station, aware of the curious glances from tourists who had witnessed the unusual scene. A Royal Guard breaking formation was rare enough, but carrying a kitten was unprecedented. He could already imagine the photos spreading across social media, but in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the fragile life depending on him. Inside the guard station, James carefully removed the kitten from his tunic and laid it on a clean towel. The fluorescent lights revealed just how dire the situation was. The kitten couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 weeks old, far too young to be away from its mother. Its orange fur was caked with dirt and what looked like dried mud. One of its tiny ears had a small cut, and its ribs were visible beneath its matted coat. The kitten trembled constantly, whether from cold, hunger, or fear. James couldn't tell. Corporal Davies, who had been managing the station, came over with a concerned expression. Sarah Davies had grown up on a farm in Yorkshire and knew her way around animals. She took one look at the kitten and immediately began issuing instructions. They needed warm milk, a heating pad, and a soft blanket. She also insisted they call a veterinarian right away. The kitten was severely malnourished and possibly sick. James made the call while Sarah gently examined the tiny creature. Her experienced hands moved carefully over the kitten's body, checking for injuries or signs of disease. The kitten had stopped crying but seemed too weak to do much more than lie still. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, and when Sarah tried to offer it some water on her fingertip, it barely responded. This didn't look good. Within 30 minutes, Dr. Emma Richardson, from a nearby animal clinic, arrived at the palace gates. It wasn't every day that a veterinarian received an emergency call from Buckingham Palace. But Dr. Richardson had treated many rescue animals and understood the urgency in James's voice. The guards escorted her through security to the station where the kitten waited. Dr. Richardson's examination was thorough and gentle. She confirmed Sarah's assessment that the kitten was dangerously underweight and dehydrated. The little one also had a mild eye infection and was covered in fleas. However, despite everything, the kitten's heart was strong, and Dr. Richardson believed it had a fighting chance with proper care. She estimated the kitten to be about 4 weeks old, probably separated from its mother too early and abandoned in the busy tourist area around the palace. The treatment began. Immediately, Dr. Richardson administered fluids under the kitten's skin to combat dehydration and gave it a gentle flea. Treatment safe for such a young animal. She showed James how to feed the kitten with a special bottle and formula designed for orphaned kittens. Every 2 hours, the kitten would need to eat day and night for at least the next few weeks. It was an enormous commitment, similar to caring for a newborn human baby. James listened intently to every instruction. He had never owned a cat before. In fact, he had never owned any pet due to his demanding military schedule. But as he looked down at the tiny creature fighting for its life, he felt something shift inside him. This kitten had somehow found its way to him out of all the thousands of people who passed by the palace each day. Maybe it was fate, or maybe just luck. But James couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to find this little survivor. Dr. Richardson prepared to leave, handing James supplies and detailed care instructions. She also gave him her personal mobile number, insisting he call at any hour if he had concerns. As she packed her veterinary bag, she paused and looked at James with a knowing smile. She had seen this look before in people who rescued animals. Whether James realized it yet or not, this kitten had already found its forever home. After Dr. Richardson left, James sat beside the kitten, now wrapped in a soft blanket and resting in a makeshift bed, fashioned from a cardboard box. Captain Reynolds stopped by to check on the situation. The older officer stood in the doorway, watching James carefully prepare the first bottle of formula. The sergeant's large, military-trained hands looked almost comically oversized as they handled the tiny bottle. But his touch was remarkably gentle. "You know you can't keep it here," Sergeant Captain Reynolds said, though his tone wasn't unkind. James nodded, understanding the reality of the situation. A military guard station was no place for a kitten, especially one requiring such intensive care. But James had already made his decision. He would take the kitten home to his small flat in South London. He would set alarms throughout the night for feedings. He would do whatever it took to give this tiny creature a chance at life. That evening, James carefully transported the kitten to his apartment in a carrier borrowed from Dr. Richardson. The journey on the underground was nerve-wracking. Every jostle of the train made him worry about the fragile passenger in the carrier beside him. Other commuters glanced curiously at the uniformed guard carrying a pet carrier, but James barely noticed them. His entire focus was on getting his tiny charge home safely. His flat was modest. A one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian building. James had lived alone for years, and the space reflected his military background. Everything was neat, organized, and practical. There were no decorative touches, no clutter, no signs that the space was anything more than a place to sleep between shifts. But as James set up the kitten's supplies in his bedroom, the flat suddenly felt different, more alive somehow. The first night was exhausting. James set alarms for every 2 hours and dragged himself out of bed each time to prepare formula and feed the kitten. The tiny creature was a surprisingly messy eater, often getting more milk on itself than in its mouth. James had to be patient, holding the bottle at just the right angle and letting the kitten nurse at its own pace. By the third feeding, around 2 in the morning, James found himself talking softly to the kitten, telling it stories about his day and promising it would get stronger. By morning, James was exhausted but encouraged. The kitten seemed slightly more alert and had managed to eat a bit more at each feeding. Its tiny meows were growing stronger too, shifting from desperate cries to demands for attention. Alarm went off for work. He seriously considered calling in sick for the first time in his career. But he had already arranged for Sarah Davies to check on the kitten during her lunch break, and Dr. Richardson would stop by in the afternoon at the palace. Word of the kitten rescue had spread throughout the guard units. James found himself answering questions from fellow guards, palace staff, and even some of the administrative officers. Everyone wanted to know how the tiny survivor was doing. Some of his colleagues teased him good-naturedly about going soft, but James noticed that even the toughest veterans had a certain warmth in their eyes when discussing the rescue. There was something universally appealing about saving a helpless creature. The story had also reached the public. A tourist had indeed captured photos of James retrieving the kitten from the gates, and the images had gone viral on social media. By midday, news outlets were calling the palace press office asking for details about the heroic guard who rescued a kitten. The palace, recognizing a positive story when they saw one, released a brief statement confirming that one of their guards had assisted an abandoned animal and ensured it received proper veterinary care. When James returned home that evening, Sarah was sitting on his sofa with the kitten nestled in her lap. She reported that the little one had eaten well and was showing more energy. Dr. Richardson had also visited and was pleased with the progress. The kitten's eyes were clearing up, and while it was still far too thin, it was starting to fight. That was a good sign. Animals that fought were animals that wanted to live. Over the following days, a routine developed. James would wake throughout the night for feedings, then head to work after the morning feed. Sarah, Dr. Richardson, or sometimes James' neighbor, Mrs. Chen, would check on the kitten during the day. Evenings were spent nursing, cleaning, and slowly introducing the kitten to more solid foods. It was exhausting work, but James found it strangely fulfilling in a way his military service had never quite achieved. The kitten's personality began to emerge as it grew stronger. It was feisty and determined, often trying to stand on wobbly legs far too early. When James would try to rest, the kitten would crawl across the blankets to nestle against his neck, purring with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small body. The sound of that purr became James' favorite sound, a reminder that his efforts were making a difference. By the end of the second week, the transformation was remarkable. The kitten had nearly doubled in weight, and its fur, now clean and properly groomed, revealed a beautiful orange tabby pattern with white paws and a white bib. Its eyes were bright and clear, full of curiosity and mischief. The tiny creature, that had been barely clinging to life, was now pouncing on shoelaces and exploring every corner of the apartment with fearless enthusiasm. James knew he needed to give the kitten a proper name. For 2 weeks he had simply called it Little One or Buddy, but the kitten deserved better. He spent several evenings considering options, running names past the kitten as if it might somehow indicate a preference. Traditional names like Fluffy or Whiskers felt too ordinary for a survivor with such spirit. Military-themed names felt too harsh for something so small and sweet. The answer came during a particularly memorable night shift. James was standing guard under a clear sky, and the moon was remarkably bright, casting everything in silver light. He thought about how the kitten had appeared in his life like a small beacon of light during what had been a particularly lonely period. That's when it came to him, Felix. The name meant lucky or fortunate in Latin, and it seemed perfect. This little cat was lucky to have survived, and James felt lucky to have found him. When James got home and said the name aloud, Felix responded with an enthusiastic meow, as if giving his approval. From that moment on, Felix became an official member of the household. James even ordered a small collar with a tag bearing Felix's name and James's contact information, just in case the adventurous kitten ever managed to escape. As Felix grew stronger and more active, the apartment transformed. What had once been A sparse, military-precise living space now contained cat toys, scratching posts, and climbing trees. James found himself shopping for the first time in years for items that weren't strictly functional. He bought soft beds, interactive toys, and even some decorative bowls for Felix's food and water. His colleagues teased him about becoming a cat person, but James didn't mind. He had never felt more content. The bond between James and Felix deepened with each passing day. The kitten would wait by the door every evening, somehow knowing when James was about to arrive home. The moment James stepped inside, Felix would launch into an elaborate greeting routine, weaving between his legs and meowing excitedly until James picked him up for proper cuddles. These reunions became the highlight of James' day, something he looked forward to during even the longest shifts. Dr. Richardson continued regular checkups, monitoring Felix's progress with professional satisfaction. The kitten was now completely healthy, all infections cleared, and weight reaching normal levels. She told James that he had done an exceptional job with the round-the-clock care during those critical first weeks. Many people would have given up or made mistakes, but James' dedication and attention to detail had saved Felix's life. The doctor also noted with an amused smile that Felix had developed quite the personality and was clearly bonded strongly to his rescuer. The viral photos from the rescue day continued to generate interest. A local newspaper asked to do a feature story on James and Felix, and after receiving permission from his superiors, James agreed. The interview took place in his apartment, with Felix stealing the show by climbing onto James' shoulder during photos and refusing to leave. The resulting article, titled "From Palace Gates to Forever Home," touched thousands of readers. James received letters and emails from around the world, people sharing their own rescue stories and thanking him for choosing compassion over protocol. One particularly touching letter came from the little girl who had been at the palace gates that morning with her mother. She wrote that seeing James rescue Felix had inspired her family to adopt a shelter cat of their own. She included a drawing of James in his guard uniform holding Felix, which now had a place of honor on James's refrigerator. It was the first personal item he had displayed in his home in years, and it made him smile every time he saw it. The palace administration, recognizing the positive publicity, invited James and Felix to participate in a charity event supporting animal rescue organizations. It would be the first time Felix returned to the palace since that fateful morning. James was initially nervous about bringing Felix back to such a busy environment, but he also felt it was important to support the cause. Felix had been given a second chance, and now they could help other animals receive the same opportunity. On the day of the event, James arrived in civilian clothes, carrying Felix in his carrier. The kitten, now 3 months old and much larger than the tiny creature from the rescue, was curious about all the activity, but seemed calm and confident. When James released him in the designated area, Felix immediately began charming everyone he met, accepting pets and treats with regal grace. It was as if Felix understood his role as an ambassador for rescue animals everywhere. The charity event was a tremendous success, raising significant funds for local animal shelters. Felix became something of a celebrity, with attendees lining up to meet the famous rescue kitten. Children especially were drawn to him. And Felix seemed to understand he needed to be gentle with young hands that sometimes petted a bit too enthusiastically. James watched with pride as his little companion handled the attention with remarkable composure, never once showing fear or aggression despite the overwhelming environment. During the event, James met other people who had rescued animals in unusual circumstances. There was a firefighter who had saved a dog from a burning building, a construction worker who had found puppies abandoned in a demolition site, and a teacher who regularly fostered kittens until they could be adopted. Hearing these stories reinforced something James had been feeling for weeks. Rescuing Felix hadn't just changed the kitten's life. It had fundamentally changed his own. For years, James had lived a structured, solitary existence. His military training had taught him discipline, duty, and self-reliance, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten about connection and joy. Felix had reminded him that life could be spontaneous and messy and wonderful. The kitten demanded attention and play and affection. Refusing to let James retreat into the comfortable isolation he had built around himself, In saving Felix, James had somehow saved himself from a life that had become too rigid, too empty. Captain Reynolds attended the charity event as well, curious to see how the famous kitten was faring. He found James surrounded by admirers, with Felix perched confidently on his shoulder, tiny paws gripping James' shirt for balance. The captain watched the interaction with approval. In his 3 decades of military service, he had seen many young soldiers struggle with the transition between duty and personal life. James had always been an excellent guard, but had seemed isolated, disconnected from life outside the palace walls. Felix had built a bridge that James had desperately needed. As autumn arrived, Felix continued to grow into a magnificent cat. His orange tabby markings had become more defined. His personality had developed into a perfect mix of playful curiosity and affectionate loyalty. He ruled the apartment with confident grace, establishing favorite spots for napping, playing, and observing the world outside the windows. James had installed several perches near windows so Felix could watch birds and passing pedestrians, and the cat spent hours engaged in this important surveillance work. The relationship between James and Felix had evolved into true companionship. James found himself sharing details of his day with the cat, who would listen with apparent interest, occasionally responding with meows that seemed perfectly timed to the conversation. When James had difficult days at work, dealing with hostile tourists or challenging weather conditions, coming home to Felix's enthusiastic greeting made everything better. The cat seemed to sense when James needed extra comfort and would curl up purring in his lap for extended periods. James' social life had also expanded thanks to Felix. He became friends with other pet owners in his building, joining an informal community of people who would gather in the courtyard on pleasant evenings while their animals played. Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor who had helped during those first critical weeks, became a regular visitor. Bringing homemade treats for both James and Felix, Sarah from the Palace Guard unit would stop by frequently. Having formed her own attachment to the rescue kitten she had helped save, the media interest eventually faded, as such stories always do. But the impact of the rescue continued. The palace reported a significant increase in donations to animal charities, which with many donors specifically mentioning James and Felix's story as their inspiration. Several animal rescue organizations reached out to James, asking if he would be willing to share his experience with potential adopters to encourage rescue adoptions. He agreed, speaking at several events about the unexpected joy that Felix had brought to his life. During one of these speaking events, a young couple approached James afterward. They had been considering getting a purebred kitten from a breeder, but had been moved by his story. They asked his advice about rescue adoption, and James spent time answering their questions honestly, explaining both the challenges and rewards. 2 weeks later, he received a photo of the couple with a rescued tabby kitten of their own, along with a message thanking him for inspiring them to choose adoption. It was moments like these that made James realize the rescue had created ripples far beyond one small kitten. A year after the rescue, the palace organized an anniversary celebration. They invited James and Felix back for a commemorative photo at the exact spot where the rescue had occurred. News outlets covered the event, showing before and after photos that dramatically illustrated Felix's transformation from a starving, abandoned kitten to a healthy, magnificent cat. The contrast was striking, and the story resonated once again with audiences around the world. Standing at the palace gates with Felix in his arms, James reflected on how much had changed in 12 months. The kitten, who had fit in the palm of his hand, now weighed over 10 pounds and had to be held with both arms. The desperate cries had been replaced by confident meows and thunderous purrs. But more than Felix's physical transformation, James marveled at his own personal changes. He had become more open, more connected to others, more willing to embrace the unexpected turns life could take. Felix, for his part, seemed completely unfazed by returning to his birthplace as a celebrity. He posed patiently for photos, accepted treats from palace staff who remembered his rescue, and even tolerated being gently petted by a visiting dignitary who had specifically requested to meet the famous rescue cat. When a small child asked James what it felt like to be a hero, James looked down at Felix and smiled, saying that he wasn't the hero. Felix was the hero for fighting so hard to survive and for teaching him what really mattered in life. The anniversary event included the unveiling of a small plaque near the palace gates, recognizing the rescue and encouraging visitors to support animal welfare organizations. It featured a silhouette of a guard and a kitten, with the inscription, "Compassion has no protocol." James was deeply moved by the gesture, understanding that it represented more than just his actions that day. It symbolized the importance of choosing kindness, even when it meant breaking from routine or taking personal risks. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after the anniversary celebration. James continued his duties as a royal guard with the same dedication and precision as always. But his perspective had fundamentally shifted. He understood now that true strength included gentleness, that discipline could coexist with spontaneity, and that opening your heart to another living being was not a weakness, but a profound act of courage. Felix thrived in his forever home, growing into a cat with distinctive personality quirks that James adored. Felix insisted on supervising James' morning routine, sitting on the bathroom counter and offering commentary through various meows and chirps. He had a peculiar fascination with James' bearskin hat, which had to be kept in a closed closet to prevent unauthorized napping sessions. And every evening, without fail, Felix would claim his spot on James' lap exactly at 8 o'clock, as if following his own precise schedule. The bond between them deepened in ways James had never experienced before. There was a communication that went beyond words, an understanding built through shared routines and mutual trust. James could tell from Felix's posture whether the cat was feeling playful, hungry, or simply wanted quiet companionship. Felix, in turn, seemed to read James' moods with uncanny accuracy, offering comfort after difficult days and playful distraction when James was taking himself too seriously. Dr. Richardson, during one of Felix's routine checkups, remarked that she had rarely seen such a strong bond between a person and their pet. She told James that rescued animals often seemed to understand they had been saved and showed exceptional loyalty and affection to their rescuers. Felix was a perfect example of this phenomenon. The cat who had nearly died alone and afraid had blossomed into a confident, loving companion who trusted James completely and brought him immeasurable joy. As seasons changed and years began to pass, James sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if he hadn't heard those faint cries that morning at the palace gates. Would he still be living in solitary precision, going through the motions of life without really experiencing it? Would he have ever learned that love and duty could coexist, that opening your heart didn't make you less capable but more complete? The rescue had taught James that sometimes the most important moments in life arrive unexpectedly, in the form of a tiny, desperate cry that most people would ignore. It had shown him that choosing compassion could change not just one life, but two, creating a connection that enriched both rescuer and rescued. And it had proven that heroes don't always wear capes or perform grand gestures. Sometimes they simply stop, listen, and choose kindness when it would be easier to walk away. Felix, now a mature and majestic cat, continued to be the center of James' world. Every day brought new moments of joy, from morning cuddles to evening play sessions, to the simple pleasure of Felix's purring presence during quiet moments. The apartment that had once been just a place to sleep had become a true home, filled with warmth, laughter, and the unmistakable evidence of a well-loved pet. James had received many commendations during his military career, medals and recognition for his service and dedication. But none of them meant as much to him as the unconditional love of a rescued orange tabby cat. Felix hadn't just become his pet. Felix had become his family, his companion. It's a reminder that life's greatest treasures often come from the most unexpected places. The story of the Royal Guard and the rescued kitten continued to inspire others long after the news cycle moved on. Letters still arrived occasionally from people who had been moved to adopt rescue animals after hearing about James and Felix. Each letter reinforced the truth James had learned that fateful morning. One small act of compassion could create waves that reached far beyond the immediate moment, touching lives and changing hearts in ways impossible to predict. And so James continued his duties at Buckingham Palace, standing guard with the same precision and discipline as always. But now, when he stood at attention during those long hours, he no longer felt alone. He knew that at home Felix was waiting, probably napping in a sunbeam or planning some new mischief. And that knowledge, the simple joy of having someone to go home to who loved him unconditionally, made all the difference in the world.